been wonderful being in your town this weekend and getting to be with your clergy. I had met with your clergy before in preparation for here. What a wonderful thing, the cooperation of the clergy, the collegiality and the work you're doing together. We've had a great weekend, and it's great to be back with Ken Madema working again. If I had Ken backing me up with music, I wouldn't be stuck in Durham. I would be out on the West Coast at a mega church. It's the only thing holding me back is Ken doesn't want to work with me every Sunday. But at Duke, over the years, from time to time, I've taught a class, Jesus, the most interesting person in the world. And what I do to start the class, I tell the students, before our first meeting, I want you to read, start to finish, the Gospel of Mark. And it's short. Even if you know something about Jesus, just try to go with your first impressions and all, and we'll talk about it. First class, we get together. And I asked them, I said, now Mark says, I'm going to tell you about Jesus Christ, who is the Messiah, who is the Son of God. And then I say to the group, now, what did you find interesting as you read through the Gospel of Mark? And one of the students says, I was kind of bothered. It says in the beginning, he's the Son of God. And, but then the first thing he does is he calls, after he's baptized, he calls these yokels that, I said his disciples. He said, yeah, whatever. And he said, he called them to do it with him. If he's the Son of God and if he wants to change the world, how come he doesn't just change the world? How comes he needs these? And he said, you expect them to be dumb in the beginning, but they're dumb all the way to the end. They never get the point. And I said, I guess you'd have, this is the way Jesus does business. But it was a moment, a marvelous moment to remember what an unusual thing it is, the Son of God, the Savior of the world, to say, I'm going to save the world from itself, but I'm not going to ever do that alone. Whatever Jesus wants to do in the world, it's kind of a wonder that he chooses to do it with us. He chooses to do it together. Jesus saves. How? From the very beginning of every gospel, you heard it this morning, whatever he does, he refuses to get started doing it without first convening, assembling, calling, congregating. It's called church. What a way to accomplish what you want to do if you're God, to us, church. And be honest, that it can be a challenge following Jesus. That stuff about love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you and turn the other cheek, and that's hard. But sometimes the hardest part of being saved by Jesus is to have to get saved together. We have to go as a group, church. Follow me. And that's amazing when you really hear that in your life for the first time. Follow me. But he doesn't just say, follow me. He also says, follow me. Where's Matthew and Bartholomew and Peter and Mary? Spoiler alert. After the scripture we heard this morning, things don't go all that well for them as a group. There is misunderstanding, there is division, there is disagreement, argument. You get to the cross, there at the Last Supper, they say, I'll follow you wherever you... Well, when the soldiers came, the going got rough, they all fled individually into the darkness. But then, what's the first thing Jesus does? The first day of his resurrected life, he returns to them and he reconvenes them. He returns to them and he says, hey, where were you guys there on Golgotha? I had a pretty good view from where I was. I didn't see any of you. What was all that? Oh, I'll stick by you. No, he doesn't say that. He says, let's get going together. He reassembles. He reconvenes. He sends as a group. It's whatever it is he wants to do in the world, he chooses to do it not alone. Church. And surely some of you, particularly those of you who are on your church's finance committee or the stewardship committee or the trustee, you'll agree with me that sometimes the hardest part about following Jesus is getting saved as a group. I teach an introduction to ordained leadership class for first-year seminarians. And what used to be, I would assign individual papers and all. Well, now what I do is I assign them into small groups of 4. And assignments that I used to have maybe one you do alone, I have them do as a group. And they got to come up with a statement about what we believe about baptism as a group. They've got to interview people in various kinds of ministries as a group. And every year on class evaluations, they tell me they hate those groups. The main thing in the class they don't like. And they will often say to me dumb things like, I didn't choose to be in a group with these people. These people are not in my denomination. These people, I don't like some of these people. Some of these people didn't do what they were supposed to do on the paper, and I had to do all the work, and I just don't like. And I said, this is called church. This is getting you ready to spend the rest of your life working for Jesus with people you don't like. It's called church. And I can tell you, when I was bishop in Alabama, people sometimes ask me in the early days, what do you miss most about your life in academia as opposed to your life here as a church bureaucrat in Alabama? And I thought about that, and my answer was, the thing I miss most is the Duke University Office of Undergraduate Admissions. Because through their work, they require essays, you have to get letters of recommendation, you have to produce your history, a transcript, you have to be examined psychologically. And it was wonderful because it meant that I got to spend every day, all day with people just like me. And they had different races and cultures and nationalities and all, but we had all been equally successful at working the American educational system to our personal advancement. And it was wonderful. We had the best discussions. We agreed. But in the church, Jesus won't let us have an admissions committee. We got to work with anybody he drags in the door. And you won't believe some of the people he's able to love. And shove them at us and said, I loved them. Now you try it. In my name. As a bishop, one of the sad tasks was to receive the credentials of clergy who called it quits. And, you'd think some of them would call it quits because of Jesus. Because, he's demanding. And you'd think somebody would say, I can't take it anymore. When I was younger, I could do it, but now that I'm older, he just raises the bar every Sunday, and he's too demanding, and the work it's just so hard, and that love your enemy stuff and all that. And no Methodist minister has ever handed in credentials because of Jesus. The reason clergy called it quits is you, the laity. They love Jesus. They just can't stand his friends. You are the problem. It's called church. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus, the church taught. No salvation outside the church. And when you first hear it, that sounds kind of arrogant. But maybe it was a humble admission that nobody comes to Jesus by yourself. There's nobody here that was walking along in the woods and meditating upon things, and nobody here who said to yourself, wow, I think a Jew from Nazareth who lived briefly, died violently, and rose unexpectedly, and then returned to the same losers who disappointed him the first time. I think he's God. I think he's the whole truth about God. Christianity, you can't do Christianity solo. So you've got to, everybody here, if we had the time, could tell about how you had to receive this faith from the hands of somebody else. Somebody had to love God and love you enough to hand it over, to tell you the story. There's nobody here that drifts into the gospel. No, you got to be brought here. You got to be taught here. It's called church. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus. And from the first, you can read it in the Gospels. From the first, it hadn't been easy to get saved as a group. I figure, half of Paul's letters are about unity, or about trying to keep it together in the church, refereeing in disputes, calling out people, trying to keep things together. From the first, it has been hard to get saved in this way. My own church, as some of you know, is going through a time of declension and division, which is always easier than together. Anyway, we got people who are saying, I'm sorry, I'm just tired of the arguments, and I'm tired of the debates, the unpleasantness at the meetings, and the voting, and I cannot worship Jesus with these people who have a very different view of Jesus than I have. I want a church where some things are not up for debate, where we're all on the same page. I want a church where we're all together and in love. And I say, look, if St. Paul didn't know how to create a church like that, I know you can't, okay? It from the first. And but also, it's a challenge, yeah. It's one of the hardest parts about being church. It's why it's so much easier to love Jesus at home, alone. Sorry about you who are joining us on virtual worship. Remember, it's called virtual worship. It's not, anyway. But admit the challenge is what the gifts. I remember asking someone, what do you love about your congregation? What do you like about your congregation? And she responded, you think I would pray for my enemies alone? You think I would do that without being pressured to do that by the church and my fellow Christians? Everybody here is here because somebody else handed it over to you, told you the story, lived it in such a way that you said, I'd like a life like that. Argued with you and pled with you and, my own church has disaffiliated from the United Methodist Church because we love the Bible more than the rest of you, or we don't want to be uncomfortable when we come to church and all. And I said, well, I don't either, but we do like it to be biblical, and that's where the trouble starts. Anyway, but I thank God I didn't grow up in that church. I grew up in a church where we heard things routinely from the pulpit that we didn't approve of. It wasn't the way our families saw it. And I'm glad that I was in a church that was where gradually, I got to hear some truth that I couldn't have heard any other way without church. And Jesus is just too difficult and demanding to try to do it solo. One of the greatest verses in all Paul's letters, a friend of mine says, is where he says, uses the Greek word allion, translated, put up with one another. Put up with one another in love. I love that. A command, put up with one another in love. How different. I've got to say to you Methodists here, and I'm not going to air dirty laundry of the Methodists in front of all these others. We don't want them to know about that. But I've been so impressed by Charlie's leadership here of this wonderful church, and as I have observed it in a couple of conversations with Charlie, Charlie kind of says, look, hey, sure, church ought to be a place where we have discussions and debate, and church ought to be a place where we air our disagreements with one another, we listen to one another, we try better to understand one another, and I'm glad for church to be that, but you will never vote anybody in this congregation out of this congregation. And no matter how fierce the debate gets, you will always come to the Lord's table together. It's called church. I got a call from a preacher when I was bishop, and he said, Bishop, we glad to have you coming to our little church. this weekend. There's a teenager that I've been counseling before baptism, and he said, I thought it'd be so cool if the bishop could baptize him. And I said, oh, that would be wonderful. And he said, oh, great. He said he's just a great kid, and he wants to be baptized by immersion. Wham! Put down the. So what? Hello? And so I went to the church there in the middle of a big cornfield in Alabama. Here's a little white church, and there on the steps, the pastor, and there was a little boy standing next to him. And I went up and I said, oh, Jason, it's so good to be what an honor to be part of your baptism today. And he said, have you ever done one of these before? And I said, baptism? He said, I mean the real way, by immersion. And I said, I've read about it, and he said, well, I'd feel better if we'd have a rehearsal. And I said, I was going to suggest that. Good. So we went in the fellowship hall, and they borrowed a font from the Baptist, and they're in the fellowship hall, and he said, do you want me to take my shoes off? And I said, yeah. I said, socks? I said, well, leave the socks on. We went through it and all. Then we went back to church, had a service. I preached on baptism. The church sang. Then we all processed behind the cross from the sanctuary over to the fellowship hall, gathered around fellowship hall. So I said, well, great to be doing this baptism today. And Jason, is there anything you'd like to say to the church before we do this? And he said, yeah, I'd like to say something. He said, first of all, I just want y'all to thank for putting up with me. I know I wasn't the easiest when I was a kid in Sunday school. And thanks, because, I wouldn't be here if you hadn't put me here. I didn't know anything about Jesus, but y'all kept telling me about it, and occasionally I paid attention, and I didn't know how to be a Christian, but I watched some of y'all, and I thought I'd like to look like that when I grow up. And thank you. He said, when my mom and daddy got a divorce, I just thought my life was over. But then you taught me that you were the family Jesus wanted for me in the first place. And thanks. And I just want to tell you, I'm going to make you proud. And I'm going to show you that all the stories you taught me and all the things you did for me, and that it's going to pay off with me. Well, I'm weeping profusely at this point, and Jason says, can you get yourself together? And I said, yeah. I said, let's go on to the font and all. Do you know how kind of un-American that is for a group of people to take responsibility for somebody else's children? Do you know how unusual it is for a life to be formed and called forth by people who are not paid to do that, and that you're not related to? It's called church.